back, there's both an application and information about Boyko Credit. There's also a little group in our congregation who's going to probably think about ways to do some social investing with your surplus capital. So if you have surplus capital that you've got invested somewhere and you're like, you know, I'd rather have a balance of it being both a financial investment but a social investment at the same time, what could that look like? There's many vehicles to do that with, but we're trying to maybe get a little social investing club going at church that can help facilitate even more localized investing with surplus capital. So you'll hear more about that in the months that unfold. We met with some people up at PLTS about that not too long ago, and a couple of members who might explore that for a while. Because that's going to be a little bit of what we talk about today as we get more towards the Sabbath economics, is to talk a little bit about what does it mean to live in relationship with your money as a faithful person of God. So we'll do a little bit of that. Dick, do you mind shutting that back door? Because I'm going to be, I mean, I like piano music, but I'm also easily distracted. One of the things that I was really impressed with was the conversation last week. When I went home after last week's, mostly some of the questions, it made me kind of rethink how to present some of this material so that it's a little bit more, that you can appropriate it a little bit more fully. And last week I talked about that we were making a transition in the way in which we understand the Jesus story, right? Out from the metaphysical world in which the Jesus story takes place, that most scholars now realize that that metaphysical world, that cosmology, if you will, is not a fixed cosmology, but it's culturally bound. It existed in a time and a place. And Jesus' whole ministry happens within a particular cosmological framework or a metaphysical framework. And so I had pushed you, and that was what my M was for. I had pushed you to think, to move beyond that, but I think I pushed too hard in that we do have to acknowledge that the metaphysical world in which Jesus did his ministry held meaning for people. It's their meaning-making world. And so just to simply say, well, let's disconnect our present Christian story from the metaphysics of the ancients might be pushing it a little bit too hard. And so as I wrestled with that, what I thought about was, what you really need to do is say, what is the heart of their metaphysic, and how do I think about my personal cosmology, the way, my worldview, and is it informed by the worldview of the people at that time? So not to dismiss it, but to take it seriously enough to find ways to find meaning in our time out from their metaphysical world. Does that make some sense? So what I want you to do, I give you a card today. Well, let me then keep going. The other piece is that what has really exploded, probably since the early 1900s, but we're finally catching up with the scholarship on it. You know we're catching up when scholars are now writing books that show up in Amazon and not on the academic shelves in seminaries, right? So now you can read, most of the historical Jesus scholars are writing for the general public now. So you don't have to go to seminary to get that stuff. You can get it right in the bookshelf of your local library. Because there's been finally a huge explosion on the historical context out from which Jesus functioned. And you can learn about that historical context so that both the worldview and the historical context are understandable enough to make some decisions about how they influence your own Christian journey. So, on your card, now I go to the card, I want you on one side of your card to put a big H for the historical cultural, and one side of the card I want you to put a big M for the metaphysical or the cosmological. And I want you to think in your head about one thing out of the metaphysical construct in which Jesus functioned that you think is important to retain for your own faith journey today. So an important lesson that you learned out of the metaphysics of Jesus' time, the way in which they viewed the world, that you want to hold on to as you move forward. And then one thing out of the historical context that you've learned that you think is important to cherish as well. And that'll be on the other side. So you'll have kind of flip side that you can hang on to, and then you can use this as sort of a little mantra piece when you get home. But I'm going to get some examples from you. So I'm going to give you just a couple minutes to think about a metaphysical mantra and a historical critical mantra that might help you as you journey in your own faith. Okay? Is that clear enough? Take a couple minutes to do that while I drink decaf coffee.
You have coffee again?
I'm off. I go off and on, and I'm like that's the definition of an addict, right? On, off. Just take another minute or so, and then we'll hear what you've got. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit while you can keep working a little bit if you like, but Paul Schmidt, one of our pastors years ago, had a great litmus test for if your faith is moving you in the right direction. And Paul Schmidt's litmus test was just simply this: does it make you more loving? And that's the bottom line. If you go to church every Sunday, no one cares unless it passes that litmus test. Is it making you a more loving person? And so I kind of wrote these two symbols on the board. One is your capacity for compassion, or your heart for neighbor, or your heart for self expanding as you're engaged in this story? Because that's what it's designed to do, right? It's designed to open you up that way. So that's one litmus test, that these two should help you to meet. The other one I wrote was sort of a spiral, in that I think it should open you up in more and more layers. If I think about my own particular journey, right, if I think about where I was when I was in Sunday school and where I am now, it feels like a spiral, right? My Sunday school self is still in that spiral, but I don't just stop and stagnate there. I'm constantly evolving and moving out from that center, and then I'm somewhere here, but I'm not going to stop. You know, it's this eternal kind of movement. To think of yourself like that too. Both of those should be tools that you use to decide how this Christian journey or this spiritual journey is shaping your own consciousness, your own way to interact with the world. But let's hear from you a couple of examples. If you're willing to share, you don't have to, but if you're willing to share, what are the things out of the metaphysical worldview that the Bible takes place in? What's something valuable that you would want to hold on to for yourself as you go forward? Or you know what? I'm going to break you into little groups, because then we don't have to hear one or two. You can actually share a couple. So get into little threesomes and just talk about that for a second, and makes it easier. So share in a threesome. Just share like one thing that you would keep from your metaphysical world, and then one thing you keep from your historical contextual world. So take a couple minutes to do that. There'll be nothing to put on film.
Was it yours? Yeah.